Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Donovan, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity College. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you all continue to be safe and well during these challenging times. Together, we're making history today, as you are all part of the first event of this year's homecoming weekend, the first Trinity homecoming conducted virtually. We wish we could be celebrating with you on campus this weekend, but are also pleased to be able to gather virtually, allowing us to more easily reach many of you. We've arranged several events this weekend that we think you'll find informative and exciting, so check out the college's website for more details on the full schedule. Today, we're proud to be able to host this conversation between two accomplished alumni, and we opted to have it kick off homecoming, feeling the subject matter couldn't be more timely and appropriate. So let me introduce our talented host and get right to it. Vivian Nebeda considers herself a creative spirit who fell in love with the arts at a young age. Her professional background is a mix of arts and culture administration, marketing, audience development, and event management. She began her professional career at Hartford Stage, a two-time Tony Award-winning regional theater, and has since gone on to work for other nationally and internationally known arts and culture organizations, such as the Amistad Center for Arts and Culture and the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. In addition to her passion for the arts, Vivian also believes in the importance of education and its ability to positively change lives. To that end, she is now proudly serving as the Director of Marketing and Public Relations at Capital Community College in Hartford, Connecticut. Throughout her adult life, Vivian has been active on various boards and committees. She is currently on the board of the New Haven Museum, as well as the Ugandan American Nakuwade Mission Project. And in 2018, she was invited to become a member of the Lamont-Bysowitz Arts and Culture Transition Subcommittee, where she assisted in the development of an arts and culture-focused agenda for the then Governor-elect Ned Lamont and Lieutenant Governor-elect Susan Bysowitz. Vivian has a Bachelor of Arts in Theater Studies from the University of Connecticut, and perhaps most notably, a Master of Arts in American Studies from Trinity College. So I'm proud to be able to turn the floor over to Vivian.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to be here, and I am really excited to kind of share this moment with another Trinity alum. I know that you are here for the man of the hour, so I shall briefly introduce Andrew Ryden, who I'm very thrilled to meet again. We met very briefly, which I might tell you about a little bit later. But Andrew is a New York Times bestselling author, National Book Award winner for March, and which we'll be talking about quite a bit today, the March trilogy, which, as I understand it, is the first graphic novel to ever win a National Book Award. He is obviously the creator and co-author of the March trilogy. He grew up reading comics and graphic novels, which we'll talk a little bit about today too. And he was the former digital director and policy advisor to Representative John Lewis, who of course is the inspiration of March. He is an avid comic book fan, and he has also written the comics for Bitch Planet, Home of the Brave, which is a Captain America series. And he is an expert on the civil rights movement. I'm going to give you expert on it because I know you wrote your thesis on it when you went to, when you got your master's at George Washington University. And of course, you are a very proud Trinity alum. So nice to see you again.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, so, no, please go ahead. We're going to get this started. And just to let the folks out here know, if we do have time, we'll be able to field some questions. Just put them right in the chat box. And if we can get to them, we can get to them, and hopefully we can. So hopefully sit back and enjoy. So Andrew, thank you. Thank you again for being here. I want to start off, I guess, with Trinity, which is why you and I are both here. And what I really liked about finding out and doing additional research on you is that you didn't just kind of come to Trinity and come to Hartford and just kind of leave. You didn't go, okay, I'm here for school and I'm going to get out and this is the first time we're seeing you again. So you have a good history with the college. I just kind of want to find out, how did you go from Atlanta all the way up here? And you also have a background in politics that we'll talk about a little bit about, but just let us know how you got to Hartford and how you liked your time at Trinity.
Yeah, no, I was born and raised in Atlanta. My father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant, and my mother, who left when I was very young, and my mother raised me. And so, we, like a lot of kids raised by single moms, we didn't have a lot of money. And so I was always hustling. And when it came to colleges, there just wasn't a lot of money at all for that. And I was really lucky that Trinity offered me a full ride. So when it came time to choose, there were two things I wanted. I wanted to get an experience outside of the South, and I wanted to not graduate in a ton of debt.
Those are good things.
Yeah, and so I took the scholarship, and I'll never forget my first winter at Trinity.
Oh, bless your heart.
Because you know, you don't have winter boots, you don't have snow boots, you don't have, our winter coat is like what you guys would consider a fall jacket. And so I remember that first snowfall, and I was enamored with it for the first half hour of it. And then and then I kept saying to my roommate, is it going to keep snowing? What are you going to do with all the snow? And then his name is Dan. He's just like, well, we live with it. I was like,
all the time? All the time?
You people are crazy. And
I know, I always feel bad for people who are not used to winter when they come here. You're just like, they're like, I can't wait to see the snow. And you're like, it gets old really quickly.
Yeah, in the South, we would say, bless your heart.
Yes, yes. I'm not from the South, but I love that saying, so I use it. So then, tell us kind of what did you study here? And I know you've also been active at your time at Trinity in state government. So I'd be interested to kind of find out how you got here, and then you parlayed that into a career within the state level, and then how you moved forward from there.
Well, I think first you got to understand that my social outlook was really informed by my mother. Seeing just the way she was treated as a single mom, particularly in the South, kind of, it instilled in me a deep sense of righteous indignation with our system.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came to Trinity, it was really the first time I had the opportunity to engage in politics. One of the things I hear a lot about kids who do, now I've experienced it, kids who do congressional internships in high school, and it tends to be like, the introduction to politics isn't, it's like their parents do it, or they're wealthy, they're from a wealthy family, and it's like John Ossoff in Georgia, right? Like his mom got him the internship, he was a high school intern, he still puts that on his resume, right? And for me, it was, I never had that opportunity. So when I got to Trinity, it was this opportunity to participate in state government. There was actually a scholarship that they gave me to be able to go and intern in Congress. It wasn't much. It was like a couple $100 a week, but I could stretch it, and that made all the difference in the world. And so I started interning. Well, truth be told, I started in student government. That was really the gateway drug for me.
Okay.
Because I got elected to the Senate.
So you campaigned, essentially.
What's that?
You campaigned?
I did, shook hands, kissed babies, all that. Although I think it's a little more of like helping people move in and stuff.
Hey,
like
listen, whatever works, whatever works.
And that was right at freshman year. And so then by the end of freshman year, I'd gotten an internship down in DC with a congressman from New Jersey that actually another Trinity student's parent helped me get, and by that point I was pretty enmeshed, just personally, and had picked my major as political science and all that sort of stuff. So it was really starting to become a part of what I enjoyed on a day-to-day basis. It was like, I think some folks, we take jobs because it'll make us money or things like that. I never actually thought I would be able to make a living in politics.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just really into it. I really enjoyed the student government. I really enjoyed working in a legislative office. And so by my sophomore year, I was the vice president of the student government.
Oh, nice.
a little strange, I think. Not a lot of kids in their sophomore year do that at Trinity, or anywhere, I guess. But I really enjoyed it. I was lucky. I had a mentor, a couple mentors where they were older than me. They sort of showed me the ropes, and I kind of got hooked. And so I ended up taking an internship with the Concord program, and then I became their campaign manager for their legislative campaign. And then we passed a bill that sophomore year through the state legislature that would it was before environmentalism and the idea of carbon offsets and everything were really part of the public conversation. So it was just going to put a piece of filtering equipment on the emissions of vehicles sold in the tri-state area. And the reason it was important to do it in Connecticut is because if you pass something in Connecticut, it forces New Jersey and New York to do it as well.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
Because everything's in that tri-state compact, right? And so in the course of that campaign, I got to interact a lot with the state legislators. And at that time, a guy named Kevin Sullivan, who was the president pro tem of the state Senate. And I don't know, I think he liked my pluck, I guess. I mean, it was, I came in with my facts and I didn't take shit. And I was ready to.
Probably young and very eager and excited.
Yeah, with a suit that didn't fit and all that sort of stuff. And so then it ended up going on with Kevin. I ended up joining his class that he taught at Trinity, which was media and public policy. And then after that class, he asked me to join his staff sort of on a part-time basis, sort of like an aggrandized internship while I was finishing up my senior year. And then I started with him the day after I graduated from Trinity. I graduated on Sunday.
You were working right after.
Well, I was working for him, as an intern and sort of part-time as a student. And then the day after I graduated was my first day full-time. And I will never forget that day because my grandmother and my mother came to graduation. And you got to remember, I'm the first person in my line of the family to go to, a school not at night, basically. Okay. Right? My mother went to Georgia State at night. My grandmother didn't go to college. She was a secretary at Georgia State. So this was a big deal to my family. And I think in some way, I couldn't tell if it was suspicion or if it was just genuine pride. But my mother and my grandmother showed up at 10:30 a.m. on my first day of work at my office.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
And I'm sitting there, I've been there for all of an hour and a half, getting my desk all in order. There's a knock at the door, and my grandmother and my mother peek their heads in, and then this is a functioning office, so it's like, oh, hello, and they're supposed to go sit down, but instead they walk right through the office, just kind of looking around, like not letting anyone stop them, till they get all the way into the lieutenant governor's office. And he was so sweet. He was just like, can I help you? And my mom's just like, that's my son out front.
Yeah, this is my son. He works
I just wanted to see where he was working, And so that was literally how I got my start in politics, and then it kind of went from there.
Well, like many things, you owe it all to your mother and your grandmother. So no, there's nothing like, the maternal figures in your life being proud of you. And there's just no shame, like, oh no, do you see him? That's him. So good. That's a good memory to have. So I guess, so then it kind of continued from there. So from Kevin Sullivan's office, then how did you end up in DC?
Yeah, I did a stint in John Larson's office, which I think a number of Trinity grads have done. My boss, even at the time, John Rossi, was a Trinity grad. And, it was at the height of the Iraq War, and the job that I'd picked up was to do veterans and military casework. And it was just really, really emotionally taxing because the country wasn't prepared for that war. The VA system wasn't prepared to take in the influx of new types of injuries. The record keeping wasn't up to par to even be able to keep track of what the injuries were while on the battlefield. I remember, particular cases you would have somewhere the records had actually been destroyed by an IED. And so they were having to reconstruct them when these people who had already been wounded were back in the States, and the VA sort of saying, I don't know if he got shot in Hartford or Baghdad, and me saying, well, this is an AK-47 round, so I don't know what's going on in Hartford, but
Right.
I'm pretty sure it wasn't in there. It wasn't there.
Thank you. Yes.
And it was just really emotionally taxing. I mean, I was 22 at the time I was doing this, and it was like I was totally in over my head, and I was fighting like hell for these kids. And a lot of them weren't much older than me. And like, I know the ones who were older would come in and be like, oh, you're going to help me. And then you end up, and we ended up helping a lot of them, but it just burns you out.
I can imagine.
And so, and at the same time, my mother was getting older. My mother still lived, by that point, she'd moved to Western North Carolina. She'd had this dream of becoming a farmer. So she bought a small farm out there. And so I tried to move closer. So I applied for several jobs on the Hill. And then it turned out John Lewis had an opening for someone to answer his mail. And, I wasn't too proud to do that if it let me move.
Right.
I was working for John Lewis. He's been my congressman since I was 3 years old. And so I'll never forget the interview. I went in and, there was actually nobody in the office at that point working who had grown up or had been from Atlanta.
Oh, okay.
And so the congressman and I, it was kind of funny because I remember us having this conversation that ended up leaving out the other people because we were talking about old Atlanta stuff, and finally I say, Congressman, I just thought you should know, like, I've been in politics now for a couple of years, and my mother had never heard of any of the people I worked for. But when I told her I was interviewing with you, she got very excited. She said, oh, he's a good one. And the congressman said, well, you go tell your mother you got a job. And that was how I started. That's how I started working for the congressman.
Oh, that's great. So who knew taking a job to open mail would lead you down this path. So that's probably a good segue to kind of talk about and our deepest condolences. I mean, the loss of Representative Lewis was just tremendous for the country, and you knew him, so our deepest condolences to you. And I think that, like, what I think for me was really interesting is how did this all come about? Like, you maybe kind of walk us through, because I think a lot of times, and I know in pre-interview, so I'm cheating a little bit, when we talked earlier, we talked about how maybe he tried a traditional path in terms of talking about his life, but tell the folks here how we ended up with this amazing trilogy called March.
Yeah. It was at a time where people really didn't know who John Lewis was. I think now his memory, his legacy, his actions are ubiquitous. But at that time, when I first started on his staff, most people didn't know who he was. And it was a real question in the district too. That was like a real challenge for the staff, that it had sort of gotten to a point where everyone was asking, what have you done for me lately? And it had gotten to sort of a critical mass because, the congressman had gone several terms without getting a challenge. And then the first reelection that I witnessed, he ended up with 2 opponents.
Okay.
And that just was sort of a reflection of, what the attitude was at the time. And he'd gotten so much blowback, in particular from the Obama crowd after he endorsed Hillary. I mean, they really came after him. I'd never seen anything quite like that. It's like his old friends were on television telling him he was out of touch, like all his nasty stuff. And I remember when we started that campaign, he asked me to come down to Atlanta and serve as press secretary, because I'd been writing for him for about a year, and I think he really felt like I'd gotten the hang of how to write in his voice, and we just enjoyed hanging out. We were like 2 peas in a pod. It's weird. We were collectors. We had we were both really into art. I mean, there was a lot of things that we enjoyed doing together, and we would just hang out and drive around, and I'd go to auctions with him because he loved to go to auction. I didn't have any money, but I'd help him bid, and so I moved down to Atlanta, and it was difficult to see this person who I knew all that they had done, or at least a lot of what they'd done growing up in Atlanta, and to see kids really not know. But then at the same time on that campaign, I heard stories I didn't even know I really didn't understand the role that SNCC had played in the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which John Lewis was chairman of from 1963 to 1965. And I remember seeing him tell those stories on the campaign trail, a lot of times to little kids. And he's talking about how these young people had so much power and they were able to exercise their power through civil disobedience. And the young people really responding to that in a profound way because they felt powerless. And seeing someone who had managed to seize their power as a young person really eye-opening to me, just to see that whole loop happening. And particularly with these stories I didn't know, even though I thought I knew because I grew up in his district. I mean, when I went to Atlanta public schools, they must have taken us to the King Center every 18 months. Like it was a regular pilgrimage. And yet none of these stories were told. It was always SCLC. It was what I call the story of gods and kings, right? Because it was LBJ, JFK, Robert Kennedy dealing with Martin Luther King. And that was the struggle with Malcolm out on the side, sort of being the agitator. And the history that John Lewis showed me was much more complex, much more nuanced. And I think in many ways, I felt frustration that I hadn't been told that history earlier. And so as that campaign developed, the question really became, how do we reinvent John Lewis? How do we tell his story to a new generation? How do we explain his history? How do we get it into schools? Because at that time, there was something called the 9-word problem, where most students, this is a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center, where most students were graduating from high school only knowing 9 words about the civil rights movement: Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, and that's it. And, a lot of the ideas that came up in that conversation were really conventional, right? It was, let's do a documentary, let's write a prose book. He'd already done a prose book by that point. He had already been in a number of documentaries. He continues to be in a new documentary every 18 months. It was something where they'd really trod that path many times, and now we're trying to do it again to expect a different result. And I didn't think in my sort of 24-year-old know-it-all brain, I was like, of course that's not going to work. And so it was coming down to the end of the campaign, and I started talking to the congressman about how I was going to a comic book convention. And some of the folks on the staff kind of laughed at me about it, like that whole like nerd thing, you're going to a comic convention, whatever. And then the congressman mentioned a comic book called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And that was the first time I'd heard about it. And he said, it was really influential during the movement. And so I went home that night and I looked it up on the internet and I read it. It was beautiful. It was 16 pages, cover to cover, this sort of studio house style from the 50s. And just for the guy in the chat, I worked for Kevin Sullivan, who was the lieutenant governor at the time. There you go. And I became enamored that night with this idea that, like, okay, here's this beautiful comic that was used by Dr. King to inspire civil disobedience during the movement. Here, we're trying to inspire another generation to both seize their power, understand their history, and do much of the same things that this comic accomplished. And John Lewis was essentially a part of every major action that happened after that comic took place, right? Because that was the Montgomery bus boycotts. John Lewis picks up within the sit-in movement. It was almost as if John Lewis wrote the next chapters to that comic. And so I just started asking him, and we would have these meetings, and it would be these strategy sessions with all these fancy people in suits making way more money than I ever did. And, they just spout out the same bad ideas. And it was, and I just started asking, why don't you write a comic book? And I remember the first time everybody it was like dead silence in the room, and everybody was just like aghast that I would suggest such a thing in that space. Like, look, kid, I know you're new here, but please, like, keep your ideas to yourself. Like that sort of like head patting. And I keep this in mind a lot too when I listen to my own interns, where it's like, don't be that guy, right? Like, don't be the one who overlooks a jewel in the grass because it's from a younger person.
Right.
And so, he even told me later, he was like, yeah, I thought you were a little out of your mind when you said that. But to me, it just seemed like totally self-evident. I was like, oh, this will work. You've got Mouse, you've got Persepolis, Fun Home has done really well. American Born Chinese had just come out. right? It was getting all of this praise. Like the literary graphic novel space was really starting to take hold, even if it was only to us uber nerds who really knew the space. And I just kept pushing, asking and asking and asking. Finally, one day he turned and he said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me. And that was sort of like the permission to do that. You know, it certainly didn't make the book happen, but it gave me permission to go out and write a proposal and try and find publishers and like try and put the whole thing together, which ultimately took almost 2.5 years to finally get a publishing contract and a publisher, because most people in mainstream publishing, again, thought I was nuts. They were like, you know, that's never going to work. Is it dignified for a congressman to do that? I kept getting turned down. And I ended up finding this teeny tiny publisher that had all of 3 people working for them that I was referred to at another comic convention, and I pitched them over the table. I mean, there was no literary agent, there was no lawyer. It was like, hey man, I got an idea. I think it's going to be big. And thankfully he said yes. I remember he made me write the whole first book on spec. So like, remember that too. There's no like advance, there's no nothing. It was like, I wrote the first book totally like on a prayer, basically, that it would work. And so then,
sorry to interrupt. I just wanted, for the folks who were not familiar with what on spec means, would you mind just kind of letting them know what that is?
Oh yeah. I mean, I just wrote it. It's like spec would be for speculation, right? So it's like you write it without a publishing contract. You write it without any sort of affirmation that it'll get printed. You just write it and hope something happens with it.
Okay, and then was Nate Powell already affiliated with Top Shelf, and that's how all 3 of you kind of came together?
Yeah, Nate had been doing his own books through Top Shelf and also in like the zine space. And you know, Nate he was a punk rocker, and then he worked with helping developmentally disabled individuals, sort of as like I don't want to say a nurse, it's more of like a helper. And then he'd been hardcore in the underground comic space. So he'd been making his own comics since he was like 10 or 12 years old. And by then, I guess he'd done 2 full-length books for Top Shelf. He did Swallow Me Whole and Any Empire. And then he was suggested as someone who should try out. And then that's how Nate became affiliated.
Okay. And so I think when you kind of think about what goes into, and just to show everyone, I have my copy. Mine is autographed, thank you. But I think when people think about all the work that has to go into a trilogy like this, how do you start? How do you even start? It feels like, you know, you're pushing a tiny rock up a large hill. So.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, because you end up making the book 4 or 5 times before it's ever done. Like, that's the crazy thing. Everybody's like, oh, it's easier to write a comic book, and it's like, no, way harder. In fact, I feel like I spend a lot of my time these days talking to people who assume it's very easy to write a comic book about their idea, and then explain to them how much work they're about to take on. And so for me, I mean, I started with a simple piece of paper, and I wrote out the outline, which was essentially at that point 7 books. And it was supposed to be John Lewis preaching to the chickens growing up, the sit-in movement, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the Convention, Selma, and then a combination of his de-election in 1966. They called it a coup in the press, de-election, sort of how we settled on how to refer to it. And then the 1968 presidential campaign. And I just wrote it out, like those were my bullet points. And then from there, underneath the bullet points, then I started writing out, and I did all this by hand in a notebook. Like, it was not fancy. It was a piece of paper and a pen. And then I wrote out what I thought the big arc should be. And then after the arcs, I broke that down into sort of scene outlines. And then once I had all the scene outlines done, I could do the script. And so then when you do the script, you got to interview the congressman, and you also have to do your research. You have to read all the books that have sort of covered this space with any sort of historical weight, which was interesting because a lot of them disagree when you get down to the nitty-gritty details.
I would imagine.
They agree on the big picture. And so then that added an additional element. And in many ways, I was glad I was a congressional staffer already, because I was very familiar with primary documents. And so then we ended up starting to get into like the deep research of SNCC, pulling after action reports, meeting minutes, other oral histories from the principal people, and then especially weighting those histories both by John Lewis's interpretation and also the closeness of when the story was told to the actual events. Mm-hmm. Because I think, as most historians know, people's story changes, especially over time. And so we would try and get to the 1968 telling of the story, or bless it if you could find an in the moment interview or something like that. And so then you would go and you would take all of that and you'd sort of put it into a big stew, and then you'd try and write a what essentially looked like I don't have a copy of one around, but like it's sort of like a movie script, but not really. There's a lot of key differences that are particular to how you tell comics. And you put that script together, and then that script gets edited, and then you make another pass on that script. Then you give that script to the artist. The artist gives you back pencils. Then you do another pass on the pencils with lettering in it. Then you give that back to the artist. Then the artist gives you back inks. You do another pass on the inks, and then hopefully you pray you're done. So that's kind of the,
just a little bit of work there.
Yeah.
just the time. And did your work on this project, is that what brought you to go back and get your master's as you were doing this work, or did it?
Oh no, that was total insecurity.
Usually people are not that honest. Thank you.
Yeah, no. I remember very clearly. I started that in 2009, so it was a year after I came back from the campaign, and I was looking around at my colleagues, and it seemed like, especially the rich kids, man, they'd all taken that gap year and gone and gotten their master's in something. And I looked around and I found out they had a night program at Georgetown. And, I loved Georgetown's campus. It was beautiful. They had all these great, like so many Hill staffers, something like 1 in 4 members of Congress as a Georgetown alum. It's crazy, right? They just like feed the Hill. And so it was really a place that was also welcoming to Hill staffers. And so I started going at night. It was supposed to be a 2-year program, but it ended up taking me 3 years because I had to take a gap to do a campaign. And I was also writing these books at the same time, so I don't feel bad about that. And, I did public policy. And one of the things I really enjoyed about that was I ended up, you would have debates in your class with the same people that you would then go fight with in your job the next day. So you'd have the State Department in there, you'd have the Senate staffers in there, the House staffers in there. Sometimes you'd have military guys, sometimes you'd have intelligence guys. And, whether, I remember one was, we were taking an antitrust class at the same time as AT&T's proposed merger to T-Mobile was happening. And that was in my policy area. And so we got to have this really detailed discussion about the ins and outs of it, and work on that in the class while we were working on it in our day job, right? And so I like that. But then, at the end of it, you have to write a graduate thesis. And I remember they were like, okay, what do you want to write 100 pages about? And I was already working on March. And my professors, only one professor really thought it was clever. And incidentally, she was Japanese. And the Japanese culture has so much more reverence for sequential narrative. And the rest thought I was just losing my mind. Like, okay, your comic's going to be huge, I swear, And I was like, well, the thing I really want to know the most about is what happened with this comic. How was it used? How was Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story distributed and printed? Who made it? I mean, the comic was made in 1957. This is just after the comic book hearings that Congress held that largely decimated the industry. So I wanted to know, like, what there's a story there. There is a there, and no one had told it before. And so I remember proposing that. And again, they were like, oh, it's that comic book nuts kid. Like, he's never going to finish this. He's never going to graduate. You know, like there's that moment. And I remember twice being scolded in our seminar class for like, why don't you pick a more reasonable topic? I don't think you'll be able to find enough. And bless their hearts, I mean, they were probably right, I think, but in some ways, they're like the way in which they said it was impossible made me want to do it more. You know, oppositional defiance syndrome. I very much suffer from that. And and so I just started digging. I mean, I called up the family of the guy who I knew had sort of been involved. I tracked down the organization. And then I ended up being able to track down all the papers that were in the archives around this. I found some at Swarthmore. I found some in Princeton's archive. And it all came from following the money. I figured out who paid for it. And then, you know, lo and behold, we found out Dr. King helped edit it. It actually inspired some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience of the movement. The congressman's mentor, Jim Lawson, was using it in his nonviolence workshops as early as 1958. I mean, all these fundamental things. But what it really gave the congressman and I was a roadmap for how to promote and distribute and use March to reach the kids, right? It was very clear after that history, after I wrote that history, that what made it work wasn't just that the comic was good. It was that Lawson and these other folks in the Fellowship of Reconciliation went around and gave workshops all throughout the South. And then from those workshops, from those events, from those reading events, many of the student activists became inspired to join the movement and passed on the comic. And it just became sort of what in my thesis, I called it manufacturing lightning, right? Like, how do you have that Greensboro moment on February 1st, 1960? How do you manufacture that, right? And our idea was manufacturing lightning again, because it wasn't just about telling John Lewis's story. It was about trying to create a tool that could inspire this generation to seize their power in the way that John Lewis's generation did. And, you know, that ended up being something that carried us for years. And we saw those dividends all over the place. I mean, I'm in touch with a number of activists who are like, dude, we came to your event, we read your book, and then this is what we wanted to do. I don't think it's a coincidence that we did a major reading program in Broward County the month before the Parkland shooting. And then those kids come out and basically use the John Lewis playbook, you know? I'm certainly not going to take credit like it was the book that gave them ideas, but it's about creating the climate. You introduce those ideas into the environment, and then somehow, some way it gets absorbed, and it just seems like the right path forward. And so we ended up, you know, touring for 6.5. I mean, I've done more book talks. I've done enough, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it was always fun because when you're doing it with John Lewis, you feel like you're on a campaign.
I can
imagine.
Know?
He was like critiquing everything. Like, you got to shake hands this way, right? You shake with your right, you eat with your left, because you never want to get caught, you know, with a dirty hand shaking at the table when somebody comes to greet you, which I didn't think was a big issue until it happened a couple hundred times over the years, you know? And he was so gracious about it. He would always introduce me. It was always like this famous person comes up and he's like, and this is Andrew, he's my co-author, you know, and you're like, oh, thanks, man, this is great, you know. And then you end up knowing these people and getting to have, I mean, you know, we had like Tim Cook introduce us at Apple and like hang out with us. And like, well, I mean, that's like wild stuff that would come from this. But he was so insistent that Nate and I be included too. And so we ended up giving these like really raucous speeches, right? Like we'd fill up an auditorium, and the congressman was like sort of training us how to give these speeches. And we you know, got where we had like our go-to jokes, and we had like our applause lines, and like we knew what we were doing. Like people would be like, do you need any prep? Like, we're just gonna put on a show. Just give us a mic and step back. And it was like, and it was amazing. And I'll never forget, like we used to make fun of each other a lot. But one of the things was I was always like, Congressman, why do you always want to go first? And he was like, well, because I don't want to follow you guys. like you're John Lewis, we're nobody. What are you talking about? But that was it, right? Like he wanted us to be on stage with him. He wanted us to be on the road with him, and he loved it.
He was very
anyway, and that's how that connects with Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, because that's how they got the book out there. And it's one thing to make a great book, and word of mouth will spread. But if you want to create this critical mass, you have to go out and be with the people. And I'm glad we did it, because I think you're seeing the dividends right now of the first generation of students who grew up with this book in their classrooms. Like they're coming for you. Like they are motivated, they are educated, they are prepared. Like watch out.
Yeah. Oh, and I think also too, part of what you know, we've been kind of talking about it, and I've been talking with my with a friend of mine, Helder, who kind of introduced me to kind of comic books and graphic novels in a certain way, which actually connects to Trinity, believe it or not. But for a course I was taking, I was trying to learn more about what, you know, what is tangible, what are the feelings, why are comics so important? And he really had a great talk with me, and to talk about they're not just these things that exist just for the sake of existing. Batman's not Batman because he just feels like it. And he made a really great comparison or discussion about the X-Men and how they existed and how they came about, and the civil rights movement. And so I say all that to say is that I think a lot of times when people think about graphic novels, there is a snobbery. I would say that for some people it's for children, and oh, it's like, oh, you're reading that. But there is a lot to be had within that culture, because as you're saying, this becomes an access point. It counteracts the 9 words problem, and you're meeting young people and probably people who are not just young where they are. So I think there's a lot of great connections. So I know what really stuck out. One of the things that stuck out with me for March is how well you humanized Representative Lewis, and you made him accessible in a way that I think a lot of times people who have gone on to do these amazing things are not humanized. And so I know that was probably a conscious effort. So if you wouldn't mind kind of talking a little bit, you mentioned earlier how you did that, and you talked a bit about that it's not up here, you have to meet him as a person.
Right. You know, one of the moments where I first realized like how people knew him, it was one of my first trips down to Atlanta with him, and he was hungry, and so he was like, let's stop at that Burger King. And so we pull over, we go through the drive-through, and the congressman's sort of like, let me order. And so he shouts through the driver's side window, and the lady on the other end of the Burger King sign goes, John Lewis, is that you? You're like, you know, like, man, they know you. He's like, who doesn't like a Whopper? And the idea of what's happened with Dr. King over the years is really just tragic to me. Reverend Warnock, who you might know is running for Senate, but is a pastor at Ebenezer in Georgia, Dr. King's old church, a couple of Martin Luther King days ago, he said, you know, the Dr. King that we celebrate today is not the Dr. King that was assassinated in 1968. Yep. And to me, you know, thinking back on that as growing up in Atlanta and the way in which I was taught about Dr. King, it was as if he was this unattainable person who I could never emulate. You know, there was no way to relate with him, right? It wasn't, he was one of the gods. And when I worked with John Lewis, you know, part of what made him so special was that he always felt like one of the people, right? He never was the one to want to go to the fancy place, or, you know, like when we did get put up in a fancy hotel, he would be like, you know, like looking around like, ooh, this is high cotton. That's what he'd say. And I worry, I genuinely worry that his memory will be turned into some sort of cartoonification. That it will be deified and carved in granite, and it will not tell the story of somebody who grew up poor, who went to school himself and worked his way through the kitchen to get by who became well known because of his actions, not because of his speeches. You know, it was John Lewis was always thought of as not the most well spoken of the civil rights leaders, but he was the one who was always willing to put his body on the line, who was always willing to do something. Whenever the question came to him, what should you do? It was always, we're going to march. We're going to get out there. We're going to participate. And I think for me, and knowing the congressman and putting these things together is really important to tell that version of John Lewis, because if that gets lost, you know, we lose this tremendous legacy that allows ourselves to see what is possible, not being rich, not having a lot of fame or anything else like that, just by getting ourselves in the way, putting ourselves in harm's way, by speaking up and speaking out. And that's so important because we need that right now. So many of us feel powerless. So many of us feel like we don't necessarily have a voice, that there's not exactly that there's not a pathway for us to right the wrongs that we see in our society. And the fact is, that's how John Lewis felt too. But he built a path, he joined a movement, he led a movement that we can emulate today. I mean, civil disobedience still works. You know, it's like, well, it's like the Amazon headquarters coming to New York, right? If you create enough ruckus, you can make these things politically unpalatable.
Yeah.
And I think the congressman would put it another way. He says sometimes he would think we're too quiet, and that we've got to make some noise. And I think that's it, right? Like that's it. Showing people how to make noise. And when you talk about like the X-Men and how like the superheroification of John Lewis, you know, that's where the phrase "good trouble" came from, because it was part of something he'd always said, but he'd never had like the catchphrase, right? And so my other job in the congressional office was I was his digital director and policy advisor. So when I did the tweets, I started adding the hashtag "good trouble" to everything. I was like, all right, that's going to be your catchphrase. And now it's like ubiquitous, and everybody's like, he's been saying it since 1961. And you're like, I did my job. And that's it, right? Like, you have to see that's why we love the X-Men. You know, I mean, it's like the X-Men are not unattainable fancy people. They are people who have some strange ability, like I think all of us do to a certain extent, right? There's something that we're all really good at, and they're maligned by society, and they come together, and their strength is in their numbers and in using their abilities together. And I think that's very much what SNCC was. And that was very much our intention, right? That you have to have the Diane Nash spokesperson organizer. You have to have the James Bevel wild man. You have to have the Bernard Lafayette, who's the grounded one. You have to have the John Lewis who will go right into the melee, you know, and you have to have that team, that community, that camaraderie to build on these successes and to seize that power.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that there are mentions of others, because a lot of times you read these, whether it's, a biography or a documentary, and, it feels like you're made to feel like all these feats happen by one person single-handedly. And there's always that support. So it was really wonderful. And thinking about somebody, a student who'd been learning about the civil rights movement, kind of the way it's traditionally taught, versus what this is. I mean, this will, and I'm not saying that because of the context of this interview, but this could change ultimately how you feel about the movement. And I think also when I was reading it, you forget how coordinated, how much work, and how and this is before we had email, before we had, cell phones. And so the work that went into creating this movement and sustaining it was so organized that I can understand, as somebody who is young, how you can connect to it in a certain way. And it feels like there's a nod to, or that you want people to understand that this is doable. This is actionable in your own neighborhood, in your own town. We did it, and you can do it. And I think that that is powerful within itself. I do want to kind of pivot really quickly. I'm still kind of new to graphic novels and comic book culture, but I do want to ask you two things that I can't end without asking. One, how does it feel to be in a comic? You as yourself, like to be immortalized in a comic. I will probably never happen to me, so I just have to know. and then I just want to talk to you briefly about Bitch Planet, because I know we're short on time.
Oh yeah. You know, the putting myself in the comic was a congressman's idea. I think part of it was to humanize the fact that it was outlandish enough that this idea existed. And the framing device of Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009, that whole day is a true story. I mean, I was staffing him that day. And in some ways, it was a reminder that by joining his staff, by working with him, that I had taken a small place in history alongside him. And it's particularly become poignant since he's passed, because not a day goes by that people don't ask for me to reflect on him and tell stories about him. And in some ways, the model for that to me was the way John Lewis talked about Dr. King. You know, and so it's fun to be in the comic, but I think that, you know, like I still have that scarf that I gave him.
You still have it?
Yeah, it's upstairs. Smithsonian's been trying to get it.
Are you gonna give it to him?
Hell no. Yeah, that's for me. But I think, you know, I'm there because of the work I did. And I think that is all too often where the result and the process get confused. I think all too often people want to be famous, people want to be well known, people want to be in historic situations, but they don't want to do the work. They forget the 5-10 years of working on your own, of, you know, working on a book that everybody told you was going to fail, that everybody told you was a bad idea, of you know, being laughed at. They forget that part. They just see the trophy and the sales and all that sort of stuff. And I try and keep that part in mind. It wasn't just being put in the book or having that as I earned that place. And you know, I think that's something I hope everybody keeps in mind, that you something the congressman would always say, you got to do the work.
Yeah.
So then you want to ask about Bitch Planet?
Yes. So, okay. So I first heard about it, obviously, through my association with a different organization. And one of my colleagues really loved the comics. And so, you know, for her road to you was Bitch Planet. And so I read the with and without. I got a copy from my local library electronically. Shout out to the libraries. But that I needed, like, it was a short, but it was powerful. And it like hit me, and I had to put it down for a second. I was like, okay, how did, and if you don't mind my saying, but it was interesting that it was done, that level of insight and that kind of comic was done, that particular one was done by two men, and that you understood women in the workplace in that way. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how that happened or how you got involved. And I know we're short on time, so we have about 4 minutes, but I couldn't leave without at least asking you about it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was writing about sexual harassment in government before Me Too. And it came out about a year and a half before the Me Too movement occurred. And for me, again, it kind of goes back to my own roots with my mother and seeing the systemic discrimination and the ways in which it's just allowed to happen. And now is part of my frustration. So it's like, if you give me a platform on a feminist satire to talk about the shortcomings of male-dominated society, like, I wasn't gonna throw away my shot on that one. I was really proud that it was before it, you know, because I find this to be a theme in my own work, where it's like, I'm thinking about something like the civil rights movement or sexual harassment and the way it destroys a workplace. And then it comes to a head in our society, right? And that was another one of those instances where it was like, I don't think we contributed to anyone's courage, but I think at least in some ways we sensitized people to the issue, right? We brought it up in front of a few people and we made them recognize what was going on. And it was also fun because Kelly Sue, who's a good friend, she let me design the government for Bitch Planet. So it's a fully functioning checks and balances, male-dominated weirdo system. And part of that was then extrapolating, like, well, what would that legislature look like? And I think in that story in particular, like most of those people are based on real people that I know. And so, I'm not going to name names, but it's too rampant. It still exists. There's not enough protections for congressional staff. Congressional staff are totally at the mercy of an institution that will do anything to protect itself. And they will cover up, they will put down, they will derail careers. And we have to find ways to use our art to sensitize people to the fact that that's going on all over the place, so that, when you see it, you don't tolerate it and you don't become part of the problem.
Right. Right.
And then you have the courage to stick up for the people in your life. And to be frank, it's not just I think part of this, the way I wrote the story, it's not just about men to women. It is about the power imbalance.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
And we don't talk about the power. Like that was the whole point, is that she was being pushed into this position because she didn't even work for the guy, but he was able to use his power to force her to do things. Mm-hmm. And that's what we really have to look at. Like, how do we treat the people who like why do we give so much power to these over their employees, right? Like, I understand legislative power, I understand governmental power, but I don't understand why we have so much personal power given to people over other individuals in the workspace. Right. And I think management techniques are all too often used as a code for how to manipulate and gaslight and control.
Absolutely. And I'm gonna close with two kind of quick questions for you. But if you have not, for those of you who are here, please, and you aren't familiar with Bitch Planet, I would encourage you to kind of check out that comic. And again, just on that really quickly, the end of the end for me was when I had to stop and put it down at that last panel. And it's a very powerful piece. And I think to your point, it talks about consent in a way that people don't necessarily think about it, and power in a way that's not discussed. But I want to swing back, because all roads go back to Hartford, because I'm a Hartford person. And you were for a time, but I want to know, to kind of go back to some of the things you've been doing things in the city since after you graduated. But one of the things that we talked about that I was really interested in hearing more about was your work with Hartford magnet schools, because it seems like it's really important for you to kind of continue that the work that you don't close a door, that there is a generation that comes behind you. So if you wouldn't mind telling the audience what you did there.
Sure. Yeah. No, I pretty regularly either Zoom in, or if I'm in town, I'll try and visit the magnet school across the street. They teach March in the classroom. A teacher named Joe DePasqua uses it often, and so I often will visit there and talk to the kids. And they make their own comics. And one particular moment that was really beautiful, they read March and then wrote and performed a play, and actually came to Washington and came into the congressional office and performed it for the congressman and the staff. We all watched it, and it was just heartwarming. And I think, there's a lot of opportunities with these books and everything to do fancy things or go do, I don't know. I think too many authors forget that your readers are really those kids, right? A lot of times people who pay you to come or those sort of things, they're not actually your readers. Like, they want to meet you. They want to understand how you did what you did. The people who are reading your books and who want to know more about what actually is in the books are the kids. And I think about that a lot. Actually, one of the memories I have at Trinity was when George Cryle, who wrote Charlie Wilson's War, came to speak, and I went and I heard him, and it was the first time that it dawned on me that I could actually be an author, and you could write about politics and things like that. And then, of course, Charlie Wilson's War, the movie, comes out and everything like that. But to that end, also one of the things that I really enjoy doing, and I do this quite a bit, or up until the pandemic I did, is I visit incarcerated youth.
So, wow.
Yeah, so I've been to prisons all across the country, from DC and Virginia to California. I even did Cook County outside Chicago, because I think it's really important that those kids know that there are people who care about them. And our system is totally set up to lock kids away. I mean, you've seen where judges are just throwing away the key because it makes them money. Unfortunately, some of those judges went to jail, but we don't know how many more, especially Black and brown kids, just get the short end of the stick because of the zip code they grew up in, how much money their parents had. I mean, I never saw a kid from I went to prep school for the latter half of my growing up, and I never saw one of those kids get in trouble for drugs or anything else. But when you go to these prisons, you realize these kids are in prison for far less than what you witnessed. Yeah. And so what I try and tell them is that you have time. So use that time to read and write. Because if you can write, no one cares if you went to jail. A fantastic writer will always have a living to make, right? And that is a skill that no one's going to ask you, have you been to jail? No one's going to, but they're not going to teach you this either. And the only way you're going to be able to get good at it is if you read all the time and everything you can, and you practice. So you got to use that time. And so I try and tell them, I was one bad day away from being right there beside you. I grew up brown with a mom who did everything she could to protect me, but it doesn't mean that the system couldn't catch me in any day, right? And it's not their fault per se that they are caught there, right? I mean, I think that's the biggest thing, this idea that we portray them as these hardened criminals. These are kids who made a mistake, and you have to treat them with empathy, because that's the measure of our society. And so anyway, not to go on too long, but that's really important to me, and I do it quite a bit.
Well, good. I'm glad. And then I guess as we're closing up shop, I want people to have a chance to know what you are up to. So if there's anything, and by the way, you probably won't say it, so I will say it for you. If you would like to get your copies of March, they are available at bookshop.org. So besides March, if there's any other projects that you're interested in people checking out, or you have something upcoming that you want to give us a teaser for, please do.
Sure. I'm almost finished. We're just doing the editing for the book the Congressman and I were working on when he passed. And we'd finished the script, and we were almost finished with the art, and now we're just finishing up the last edit. So that'll come out sometimes next year. It'll be called Run. You get it first, you march, then you run, because I think that's the next stage, right? You can't just be a student activist, then you have to become a public servant. And we need to do something to inspire more public servants. And then, I've been doing other fun stuff, really. It's just sort of therapy. I wrote for Batman. I wrote for Teen Titans, and I did a PSA for Rock the Vote in DC Comics. I did an art installation. I led a team that created an art installation for Ben & Jerry's factory in Waterbury, Vermont. So if you're up there, there's a 35 by 5 foot installation on the entrance to the factory that we did. And my other thing that I do is I farm. My mother passed away about a little over 3 years ago, and I took over her farm, and I bought a tractor, and I've been farming.
Wow.
It's not what people expect.
No, I have a small garden in my house. I have started, strangely enough, my mother passed away about 2 years ago, and I started growing a garden. So I get it. I do not own a tractor. I do not trust myself. But Andrew, we cannot thank you enough. This was
Oh, thank
so,
you.
so wonderful. And everybody who came, thank you so much. We appreciate you sitting here for an hour and listening and learning, and I'm taking my notes. So Andrew, thank you. And we look forward to your next upcoming book. And I'm sure Trinity will be giving you a call, and maybe they'll be nice enough to call me too. So take care, everybody.
It was great. I enjoyed it so much. Thank you. Stay in touch, okay?
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.